So, welcome back to my talks. Today's talk is going to be part two of the one that I started about 10 days ago about memory, forgetting, and dementia. As an outline of the talk, I'm going to give you a very quick recap of some of the things that I said last time, and then go into different levels of forgetting, because as a neuropsychologist, I know that although I work with people with brain damage, most people are interested in general forgetting and how that differs. Now, that allows me to move into what is dementia, because there's a lot of confusion about what this thing called dementia is. And one of the things I'm going to try to do in this talk is to explain the difference between forgetting, dementia, Alzheimer's, etc. And that will allow me to go into what I'm calling the family of dementias, because dementia is actually a very generic umbrella term for many different problems which are related, but which are also somewhat different to one another. Then I'm going to illustrate this with Ron's journey. And Ron was the father of a new friend of mine, Tony Husband, who is an illustrator. And Tony has illustrated a beautiful book called Take Care, Son, about his father's fight with dementia before his passing away. Then I'll talk about detecting dementia and what's happening on that front, and then move into some work that my group has been doing. So as a recap, last time I talked about how by studying people with very specific memory disorders, we can take this huge thing called memory and we can split it into two things: short-term memory, which is literally just about 1 minute, 90 seconds at most. So not last week, not yesterday, not this morning, literally 90 seconds ago at most. So if I gave you my phone number, it would be, you'd use your short-term memory to try to hold that information in your mind, literally in your mind, to try to remember it, to write it down or to dial it. Then long-term memory, which is anything beyond those 90 seconds, which we know from studying people with different types of memory problems, breaks up into two separate types of memory: procedural memory, which is memory for skills, such as being able to play a guitar, touch typing, etc., and declarative memory, which is memory for facts. And we know declarative memory breaks up into two different types of memory itself: into episodic memory, which is memory for events such as my 50th birthday party, or facts about the world, such as Einstein's famous equation about relativity. So what we get here is a beautiful demonstration of the fact that by taking something like memory, we can study people with different types of disorders, and we can get this rich understanding of the many different layers to memory and how they break up into a bit of a jigsaw. And by studying people with amnesia, we can see that it's not every aspect of memory that's damaged in these people, but certain elements. So we know, for example, that someone with amnesia actually has intact, so no problems with their short-term memory, and also intact procedural memory. And I've demonstrated that a bit in one of my previous talks, and there will be a talk in a couple of weeks' time about improving memory, in which I'll talk a bit more about that. So now I want to turn to a different issue, which is poor memory versus amnesia, which was mainly the topic of the last talk, and then dementia, which is the new element today. As I just demonstrated with my memory tree, as I call it, memory is a very complex entity and skill. Reams and reams have been written about it, and we still don't really understand it. Importantly, we know that forgetting is natural, and there's something known as the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve, which is a clear demonstration, or the fact that as we go further back in time, from the last couple of minutes to the last few hours to the last few days, weeks and months, our memory progressively gets worse. And so effectively, a couple of minutes ago is very sharp for me as a memory, whereas what happened a few months ago is a weaker memory. And that's a standard thing, and very few people would argue against that. So forgetting is natural, and there are probably good evolutionary reasons for that, because the moment that I've just had is actually more important to me than the one I had months ago, when I might have been having a horrible time or when I was still learning something. So yeah, the last moment is very important. So forgetting is okay. But we also know that memory can be broken up into all these different parts, like I demonstrated with my memory tree, and it can break down with different neuropsychological disorders due to different types of neurological problems. So I'm going to demonstrate that with a video that I did show last time, but for those who didn't see it before, it'll be helpful to see me working with the patient Nicola, who suffered from viral encephalitis, which destroyed parts of her brain. And in this video, you'll see me talking to Nicola and giving her some words to remember. See how many words you yourself can remember after I've given Nicola 8 words. Then I'll engage her in conversation for 45 seconds just about TV. Then I'll return to those words and see how you do at that point. And then I'm going to go out of the room to see whether she remembers much.
Right. Have you been on holiday recently?
I think so. We haven't, have we? Oh, we have. Oh, I beg your pardon. I don't remember.
Okay, Nicola, I'm just going to try just a small memory test with you. Is that okay? Okay, I'm just going to read out 8 words to you, and what I'd like you to do is to just, when I'm finished,
repeat
whatever you can. Okay, so are you ready? Okay. Table, lion, apple, shoe, carpet, robin, carrot, flower.
Table, apple, lion, shoe, flower. Can't remember anymore.
You did pretty well there. You got 5 out of 8. So
I got about 4.
well, you did better than Reg there. So well done. Okay, how are you at recognising people on TV? Do you watch much TV or films?
I watch television, don't I? And films.
Mm-hmm.
Do you recognise the people on the film?
I don't know, do I?
Sometimes.
Sometimes.
What's your favourite programme?
EastEnders, I suppose. If we have it on.
So what's happening in EastEnders at the moment?
Well, I couldn't tell you.
Okay,
I'd have to wait for it to start, and then
it comes back.
I think, oh, so.
Okay, I'm just going to go back to those words that I gave you. Can you tell me what words I gave you?
No, I can't.
You even remember one of them?
No.
Okay, now I'm just going to see how well the couch over there does. Okay.
Apple, lion, robin.
Robin, table.
I've got 4, you see.
That's 4 again, yeah.
Fine,
That was between 2 of you there.
yeah.
Right, yes,
yeah.
Okay.
I've got 2, that's fine.
Now, if you don't mind, I'm just going to go to the bathroom. It's
Right.
just near
Just
the door,
round by
isn't it?
front door, yeah.
Okay. If you guys just want to talk about what you did in Spain.
What we do is
Yeah. Tell Nicola about what you guys got up to in Spain.
You remember going to Spain? Yeah, you got back on
No, I don't remember going.
Thursday.
Tuesday night.
Tuesday.
Hello, everybody.
Hello.
Hi, Ash.
Hello. Have we met before?
I don't think so.
No. My name's Ash.
Okay, so there you see a very, very, very profound case of amnesia. And unfortunately, you see that although Nicola is able to remember 5 of the 8 words that I gave her, which shows that she's able to take information into her short-term memory, the thing that lasts for about 90 seconds. Once I speak to her about anything else, the information that she had, which was the 5 words, has been basically taken out of there or dumped, because her ability to create new long-term memories has been greatly affected. And you then see that after I come back from being outside, she doesn't even know who I am. So effectively, she's trapped in her current 90 seconds and that's it. She can't create new long-term memories. So by studying people like Nicola, we find that some disorders cause a permanent but stable disorder known as amnesia. So in Nicola's case, the disorder was permanent. It was never going to get any better, but it was stable. So it wasn't going to get worse either. But we also know that other types of disorders cause permanent and degenerative memory problems. And those are the ones that I want to talk about today. So we can have memory problems that can be caused by what we call psychogenic factors, which are more emotional. They're not caused by physical brain damage. Then we've got organic problems, which can break down into transient, meaning that they only last for a little while and then the memory does come back. And those include things like transient global amnesia, from electroconvulsive therapy, and post-traumatic amnesia, PTA. But those are transient, they only last for a little while. Then we've got permanent disorders. And these break up into stable, where they can be material specific, to do with faces, places, or objects. And one of my earlier talks in this series was about a condition known as prosopagnosia, where people have lost the ability to recognize faces, and global, where the problem is with all types of information. And in Nicola's case, she'd suffered from herpes simplex encephalitis, so that's HSE, but there are lots of other causes, including something called Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome, or closed head injuries, or lack of oxygen to the brain, carbon monoxide poisoning, etc. Then the permanent and degenerative ones, they go down a different route, and those involve the dementias, as I'm calling them, and then disorders that some of you will have heard of, such as Huntington's disorder and Pick's disease. And what I want to talk about is what is dementia. Now, this is a very confused term, and it's used so interchangeably with Alzheimer's and with forgetting that I thought it would be useful to try to look at this a bit more. So this is a definition that I got from the NHS website, which is that dementia is a syndrome, which means that it's a group of related symptoms. So it's not just one thing, it's a number of different symptoms that are associated with an ongoing decline. So that's an important point, that things are getting worse. Whereas with Nicola, things had, her brain had got damaged and she had that awful amnesia. It wasn't an ongoing decline. It wasn't going to get worse. But with the dementias, there is this ongoing decline in brain functioning, which can include, but is not solely to do with memory loss, thinking speed, so ability to just think and sort out problems, give answers, slows down, mental sharpness and quickness, language. So with some forms of dementias, people start having problems with finding the right word, naming objects, general understanding of what people are saying, so getting confused very easily, judgment, so making decisions, mood, so there are big mood problems that can happen, particularly with frontotemporal dementia, which I'll come to in a moment, and even movement. So there are problems that can happen with physical movement that happen because of the dementias. And then finally, just carrying out daily activities such as cooking, shopping, or driving. And the reason for that is because these activities involve a lot of other things such as memory, being able to make decisions, etc. So to illustrate the beginnings of what I want us to understand, I'm going to show you a video of Sir Terry Pratchett, who, those of you who don't know, he was an author of the Discworld series, which is a fantasy world of novels. And Terry was very well known anyway as an author, and then it turned out that he had got a diagnosis of dementia. So this is a really poignant video of him talking about his diagnosis.
I was diagnosed with PCA about 11 months ago now. In fact, I was diagnosed with Alzheimer's because that's how I heard it. I thought it could be worse, it could be my wife. And that was how I saw it initially. I got mine because I went back. I was misdiagnosed initially. I was told I hadn't got any real problem with my head at all, maybe some loss of brain cells. I felt very alone because I thought if I'd had cancer, for example, there would be some path, you get the specialist, you do the tests. And with cancer, hope exists. And when you've got cancer, you are a brave battler against the disease. When you've got Alzheimer's, you're an old fart. That's how society seems to see it. So I felt quite alone.
So what you see there is Terry talking about, first of all, being confused, little bits of forgetting, etc., and then getting this diagnosis. And he says that if it was cancer, in a weird way, it would have been easier because there are terms such as being a survivor and fighting, etc., because there are survivable cancers, such as prostate cancer, for example, some forms of breast cancer, etc. But that sort of language doesn't exist around Alzheimer's. And he said that he felt alone. And I think this is one of the big problems. This Alzheimer's or a dementia is a very lonely disorder because at the moment there is no treatment and cure, so you know where things are going to go. So what I want to do is to now talk a bit about what these dementias are. And as I said, it's an umbrella term to describe this range of different disorders. And what we see here is that about 50 to 75% of people with dementia have Alzheimer's, which is a particular dementia. 20 to 30% might have vascular dementia, 10 to 25 something called Lewy body, and then 10 to 15% have frontotemporal. Now, some people will have a mixture, so this is why those numbers can overlap. Now, just to give you a sense of the fact that we're talking about things that anyone can get. Terry Jones, one of the Monty Python team, who was the famous mother in The Life of Brian, who said he's not the Messiah, he's a very naughty boy. He suffered from frontotemporal dementia and passed away a couple of years ago. Lewy body dementia is something that Robin Williams suffered from. And very interestingly, and I'll bring this point up again in a bit, initially, people thought that his only thing was that his bipolar condition or his depression. But before he died, he was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. And in fact, it wasn't Parkinson's that he actually had Lewy body dementia, and I'll explain why in a moment. Then this dashing man is Ron, whose story I'm going to tell you about in a bit. And that is Ron Husband. And Ron had vascular dementia. Ronald Reagan, the former president of, and the late president of the United States, had Alzheimer's. Then the dashing Egyptian actor Omar Sharif also had Alzheimer's. Now, I think it's rather coincidental and prescient that given what's happening with Black Lives Matter and George Floyd, that Rosa Parks, that extremely brave girl who said that she was not going to sit in the colored only part of the bus in the South of America 65 years ago, she also had dementia. So lots of people, through well-known people, have had these conditions. And one of the things that I've found in my career is that sometimes it's only when a famous person gets a disease or a disorder that a lot of the general public hears about it. And this is why, for example, Terry Pratchett became such a big advocate for more research in the dementias and Alzheimer's, because until that point, people didn't really think of it much more than, oh, you're a boring old fart now, or a forgetful fart, I think was the term that he used. So we've got this thing called dementia, which is many different things. This is a slide of proper dissected brains of a healthy brain, and then the brain of someone who had died from severe Alzheimer's. And you don't need to be a neuroanatomist to see that there's a huge difference. There's a massive shrinkage, and the shrinkage of the brain effectively is because of the death of lots of brain cells. And this is a diagram that I found in an article, which starts in the top left-hand corner, which is what the brain, this is a diagram, and this is if you'd cut down the middle of the brain and you were looking at it with the front of the head being on the left-hand side and the back of the head being on the right-hand side. Any pinkish colors you see there are any problems in the brain. And what you see is that initially, when we trace back to with people who've had dementia, when there are no symptoms at all, we can still already see some problems in an area known as the medial temporal lobes, and particularly an area called the hippocampus, which is the memory center of the brain. Now, importantly, Nicola, who's the video that you saw of me talking to Nicola and giving those words, it was her medial temporal lobes that were damaged by her encephalitis. So what we see is that the starting point of a dementia, particularly Alzheimer's, is from these medial temporal lobes, and that's why memory is the first problem you see. But then a number of years later, you're seeing more of that pinkish color in that same area, and that's to do with the dysfunction. So this is damaged brain cells that they can pick up in brain scans, etc. Then eventually you see that the damage is spreading beyond the medial temporal lobes and into also the frontal part of the brain. And the frontal part of the brain, which this area here, is something that I talked about a few weeks ago in my talk, The Brains of the Brain. And that damage there starts making things become much more obvious in someone's dementia. And the red that you're now seeing in that area where the damage initially started implies that now the damage in that area is very severe. So it will have got to the levels of the severity of Nicola's damage, which was caused by something else, a viral encephalitis, but the end result is damage in the same area. And then finally we end up in bottom left-hand corner with the full-blown dementia with damage in all sorts of different areas of the brain. So that would be with standard Alzheimer's. Then this image is multiple brain scans to demonstrate the areas of the brain that can be damaged in Alzheimer's disease on the left-hand side and frontotemporal dementia. Now, the details aren't important, but the main thing to note is that there are different areas that are getting damaged in the two brains. The big difference is that there's a lot of damage in the frontal area in frontotemporal dementia, and it's also going deeper into the brain. And that means that there's, because what's happening in those areas to do with personality and emotions, we see much more of a particular type of problem and sometimes violent behavior as well in frontotemporal dementia, which you don't see as much in Alzheimer's disease. This scan here is as if you've sliced through the top and you're looking down, and it's the the dark grey areas, not the black areas, but the very dark grey areas that we see in some parts of this brain. It's not very clear, partly because this is the brain of someone with vascular dementia, which is what Ron got, who I'm going to talk about in a minute. Now, the reason for that is that vascular dementia is not specific in the areas that it affects. It affects lots of different areas, and it's about damage to brain to blood vessels, which then damage the brain areas that they're feeding. Excuse me. Then the next type of dementia that I mentioned was Lewy body dementia. And excuse me, I'm just going to get a lozenge. I don't think it's coronavirus, so you don't need to send me a testing kit. Okay, so Lewy body dementia is a term given to a type of dementia where in the heart of a nerve cell, so from one of my earlier talks, I talked about what nerves are. So it's basically this little center with arms going off of it, cables going off of it, which talk to other cables, and that's how you pass information from one nerve cell to the next nerve cell. But the heart of the nerve cell is the nucleus. And in the central area there, what happens is that you get these invaders, which are known as Lewy bodies, and they somehow lodge themselves into the central area of this nerve cell, and they start impairing the function. The details aren't important, but basically you're getting an invasion into the central area of a nerve, which then eventually means that those nerves can't work properly. Now, in this diagram, what you see is that people who have dementia with Lewy bodies, so Robin Williams, for example, those Lewy bodies, the people with that type of dementia, such as Robin Williams, they'll have damage which is more on the outside areas of the brain. Whereas people who have Parkinson's disease, their damage, it's again very similar, the Lewy bodies, they're in more central areas of the brain, which are more involved with controlling of movement. But the actual damage is still the same thing. It's those weird invaders into the central area of the nerve cell. But some of the damage in people with Lewy body dementia also affects those movement areas, like in Parkinson's disease. And this is why, towards the end, Robin Williams did have movement problems. And this demonstrates how complex dementia is, because you can have damage to just the memory centers, which we saw initially with the medial temporal lobes in the top left-hand corner. Then you can have damage in the frontal areas, which can control personalities. With the vascular dementia, you can have much more widespread damage in all sorts of different areas of the brain. And then because of the Lewy bodies that can lodge themselves in the control centers of nerves, you can end up with, if those Lewy bodies get to the movement areas of the body, or sorry, the brain, you can end up with movement disorders as well. So what we get is, if you remember the slide in which I gave you the definition of dementia, you see there's a whole list of different things. The first and most prominent one is a memory problem. But all of the other ones are to do with the fact that the damage is happening all across the brain, in different areas of the brain that control our mood and emotion and personality, our language, which is around here, our memory in here, the movement, which is further into the brain. So effectively, you're shutting down different control centers of the brain, each of which takes care of a different skill. So in terms of dementia prevalence and cost, here what you see is the major continents split up, and the number of people with dementia in 2015, so 5 years ago, the projected numbers for 2030, and then the projected numbers for 2050. So taking the Americas, for instance, 5 years ago, there were 9.4 million people with dementia. That is expected to triple in the next 30 years. We're not expected to see as much of a difference in Europe. So we're going from 10.5 million to 18.6 million. In Asia, we're seeing a tripling, just like we're seeing in the Americas. In Africa, we're seeing virtually a quadrupling from 4 million in 2015 to nearly 16 million in 2050. So what we're seeing is overall in the world, 5 years ago, there were about 46 million people with dementia, and in 2050, it's projected to be 131 million. So roughly a trebling in the space of 35 years. And this has huge implications cost-wise, etc. The estimated annual cost was about 818 billion US dollars in 2015, but that is projected to go up to, in 2018. So just 3 years later, it had gone to the 1 trillion mark. By 2030, so in 10 years' time, that's going to double. So God knows what they're expecting it to be in 2050. It's going to be ginormous. Now, the reason that we've got this huge increase is actually because we're getting better, we're more able to detect it. It's not necessarily that this is a growing problem. It's not because there's sickness or anything like that. There are issues to do with the fact that as general health increases, life expectancy increases in each of these countries. And so what we're ending up with is that people in sub-Saharan Africa, parts of Asia and the Americas, people who used to have a lower life expectancy, or certainly their parents had a lower life expectancy, thankfully, because of improvements in health, these people are living to older ages, which is fantastic. But the thing is that those dementias are within us, within our genetic code, and therefore, if people are living to older ages, then you're going to get more of more diagnoses. And we see in Europe, for example, the reason that there isn't that huge increase in dementia diagnosis is simply because the life expectancy has not increased as much, simply because Europe already had a decent life expectancy. So that's one reason that we've got an aging population because of global health improving. Another reason is that we're getting better able at detecting it. So generally speaking, we need to do something about this because it's a time bomb waiting to go off. One issue that I found rather interesting in my research looking at this is that there are cross-cultural differences in attitudes to dementia. In Asia, the attitude towards aging is very different to in Europe, for example. And then also whether people will put their loved ones into a home or not. And these are data that we found about nursing homes in the States, and it's about the percentages of people in nursing homes of different ethnicities. And what you see is a bit of a spread in terms of whether people are black, white, Hispanic, or Asian. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's more dementia in some communities than others. It might simply be a reflection of the fact that maybe Hispanic and Asian cultures tend to keep their families at home if they've got forgetting, etc., rather than suggest that they live in a nursing home. But it's just interesting that there are cross-cultural differences to the way we approach dementia. Now, I'm coming close to the end, and this is where I want to introduce you to Tony, my new friend, who's there in the top right-hand corner. Tony is an award-winning cartoonist and illustrator working for magazines, publications such as Private Eye and many others. Now, Tony and I were introduced to one another by a friend of mine, Matt Bradford, who found out that I was working in the area of dementia, and he said that I should talk to Tony. And it turned out that Tony, his father, Ron, whose photograph you saw earlier, was diagnosed with vascular dementia. And Tony said that after his father had passed away, one day he was sitting, drinking some red wine and thinking about his father, and he started having conversations in his head with his father about what it must have felt like to have dementia before he passed away. And being an illustrator, he started drawing some diagrams, some cartoons of what this imagined conversation that he was having with Ron. And he's created this beautiful book. I'll show you the cover of it in a moment. And what I've done here is just picked some of the beautiful cartoons that he did, which really nicely give the human element of dementia. I've been telling you about the science behind it and the economics of it, etc. But here Tony is talking about his beloved father and what happened. So in this, Tony was saying to his dad, "So how did it start for you, Dad?" Just that, forgetting things, I suppose, dates, names, appointments, daft things, important things. What I'm on Ron was a keen golfer, so he got a phone call and Ron was saying, "What? I'm on the tee in 10 minutes. Bloody hell. No, of course, I'd not forget. I'm on my way." So that's a classic example of what looks like just simple forgetting of something that might have just slipped your mind. So that's the first signs. But things began to change, didn't they? Tony was saying to his father in this pretend conversation. "We noticed you weren't the same, but we couldn't pin it down. It was just a feeling we had. Yes, things did change slowly. I mean, we all forget, and that's the problem. When do you realize it's a different form of forgetting?" And I think this is the crux of the problem we've got, that forgetting is something that all of us experience. And I've got a memory like the oldest she elephant around, but I can forget things if I'm tired, if I'm stressed, if I haven't eaten well, etc. So if I've forgotten something, is it just because I'm stressed, or is it because there's a problem going on? And drawing that line between this is just forgetting because of something odd that's happened and real and a major problem like dementia, we can't draw that line yet. But then Ron said that but I didn't trust anyone, not even my family. And Tony says, "Especially your family." "Hi, it's us." And Ron would say, "Come to get my money, I bet." "Well, you're not having it." Now, remember, these are pretend conversations, but it's just Tony's way to illustrate what his father experienced. And then Ron said, "The strange thing was, though, my distant memory cleared up. I could remember stories I'd forgotten about my childhood," which is interesting. And I talked about that in my talk last time, which is about something called the reminiscence bump, that as we get older, we're able to remember those earlier parts of our lives very well. So Ron was able to remember things from his childhood really well, but not remember that he was supposed to be playing golf today, something that he adored doing. And then it got to the point where Tony and the family had decided to take Ron to the doctor because they were getting worried. And Ron says, I didn't want to go, got annoyed about it, all those questions. How is this supposed to remember all that? Bloody ridiculous. So that, of course, is where an individual is being confronted with their own frailty and being tested about it. And of course, at this point, Ron's just thinking, why are they bloody well doing this to me? But then Ron got the diagnosis, and along with the diagnosis comes a list of recommendations. And one of them is, because of the problem of driving, if you've got memory problems or things like that, you're not allowed to drive a car anymore. So Ron said, and if hearing that wasn't bad enough, I had my car taken off me. That was hard to take. My independence was being eroded bit by bit. I felt isolated, lost. So what you see here is the memory problem, this diagnosis or a label, and then that ability to do things yourself. And Ron was obviously a very proud man who did so much. He was the president of the golf club. He did lots of things, and now he had to be reliant on other people. There's also a very poignant cartoon about Ron's lovely dog Lossie, who was taken away from him because he wasn't able to look after Lossie. And then finally, Ron was in the home, and Tony's saying, you rarely left your bed. You didn't recognize any of us. You even stopped playing your music. Our only comfort was that you were protected and warm. Hello, not getting up again? Let's have a look at you then. So this is towards the end of Ron's life, where Tony and his wife would be visiting Ron, and Ron was disappearing. And he, as you see, he couldn't recognize Tony. And I think this is one of the most cruel things, that the physical person is still there, but the mental person, the one that you've got the connection with and you can talk to about your past, etc., is gone. This is a really beautiful book, and it's called Take Care, Son, because those were the last words that Ron said to Tony before he passed away. And this book has done wonderful things. It's now used by lots of dementia organizations. It's in hospitals, care centers, etc. So I'd highly recommend it if you know someone who suffers from dementia, because it will give you a really lovely personal insight into what this thing called dementia is. And after lockdown, Tony and I are planning on doing work together where we have the artist and the scientist talking about dementia to try to get more public awareness of this condition, to try to get more research done. And we'd be very happy to hear from anyone who's interested in that, in the talks and events that we're going to do. So the final thing I want to talk to you about is the drug discovery pipeline. Because in the UK, dementia is the only condition in the top 10 causes of death without treatment to prevent, cure, or slow down disease progression. So all the other 9 causes of death, there are treatments to at least slow something down or to cure it or completely prevent it happening. So it really stands out. And given the numbers that I showed you earlier of the increase in diagnosis, etc., there's a real thing here that we've got to be careful of. Unfortunately, 99.6% of drugs have failed recent clinical trials. The attempts to find a drug that prevents, cures, or slows the disease have just not been very good at all. The first treatment was in 1993, and one of the treatments was known as, I think, LMTX, and it's a particular drug that I think targets the physical biological thing that that we think is most problematic in the nerves in Alzheimer's. And Time magazine got very excited and had various articles about at last some progress in fighting this awful disease, etc., and curing it. But unfortunately, they had to pull it pretty quickly because they found that it was ineffective in clinical trials. So initially there was a lot of excitement, but the results have not been good. So there have been no new drugs since 2003. So although we're seeing more and more of more and more diagnoses, a greater public awareness, although that needs to increase more, we haven't had anything for quite a long time with new drugs. Why these drugs are failing, it's impossible to tell, but there's an interesting parallel with the coronavirus, because the drugs can only work if we really understand what the problem is. So they need to understand what is causing the Alzheimer's, what is it that's happening to these nerve cells that's killing them in the medial temporal lobes, in the frontal areas, etc. What is causing those Lewy bodies to lodge themselves in the control centers of these nerves? And what's causing the vascular dementia and the nerves or the blood vessels to burst, etc. And without knowing what's causing those, it's difficult to do targeted treatment. So it could be that the treatment was too late, because with some physical disorders, there's a point after which it's too late to do something. So it might be that there's a point during which, when the diagnosis is, when the disease process is still relatively new, that it might be possible to use some of these drugs. But if the person has, just making up some numbers, if the person is already 50% towards a full diagnosis, maybe it's too late for those drugs to have any effect. And maybe the important point is that we need to try to discover the dementia much earlier. And if you remember when I showed you the brain scans and the the diagram in the top left-hand corner of how initially there's some little disorder in the medial temporal lobes, and then that starts growing, and then it starts spreading to the front of the brain. That initial problem in the medial temporal lobes, if we can find that earlier, then maybe we can start people on drug trials much earlier than we can currently do, because at the moment, it's 10 years after those initial things have happened that people get their diagnosis. And so one of the holy grails at the moment is that if we can't prevent or cure dementia, then we should be acting to try to diagnose it much earlier. Because if we can diagnose it before the disorder has got very bad, then maybe we might be able to put a halt to it. And that brings me to the work that I've been doing with my amazing PhD student, Terry McGibbon, where we've created a test called the VALMT, and our results are very promising at the moment. And in this task, I won't give the details of it, but we teach people certain verbal information, because verbal information, pairs of words, is easy for us to control and to look at the effects of it. And after teaching people these words and word pairs, we test them 5 minutes later, 30 minutes later, and 55 minutes later. Now, our young group, who tend to be in their 20s, if the maximum score is 12, they score very well after 5 minutes, and 55 minutes later, there's very little forgetting. When we look at elderly people, so people in their 60s and upwards, what we're finding is that there are two distinct groups within the elderly people that we've been testing. One group, who we'll refer to as elderly A, they don't seem to be any different from young people. So as you can see, just like the young people, they're scoring almost 12 out of 12 after 5 minutes. And then after 55 minutes, they're just marginally less than the young people, but not to a point where you'd be able to tell any difference. So those are sharp, healthy, elderly people, and there doesn't seem to be anything wrong with them. But there's another group that perform like this. They even start a bit worse than our elderly A. They're performing a bit worse at 5 minutes, a bit worse at 30 minutes, but by 55 minutes, they're performing extremely poorly compared to people who are the same age as them who don't seem to have any problems. Now, importantly, these are results that we've got a number of times with studies that we've been doing. Importantly, these same people are elderly A and elderly B. On the current test that clinicians use for trying to detect dementia, on those current tests, elderly B don't have any problems. But what we're seeing is that elderly B on our task are beginning to show problems. And when we ask these people to do a questionnaire about what their memory is like generally, and say on a scale of 1 to 5, what's your memory like on a day-to-day basis, etc., we find that elderly A end up telling us that they don't have many memory problems, and elderly B tell us that they've got memory problems. So when we ask them subjectively about their lived experience and whether they forget to do things, elderly B are the ones who tell us that they have memory problems. On our task, they're showing objective memory problems that we can categorically see statistically here, but on the standard test that clinicians currently use, we're not able, on those tasks, elderly B are performing like there's no problem. So what this suggests is that our task VALMT might be able to pick up these preclinical signs of dementia so much earlier than the current tests are able to detect dementia. And if that is the case, then what that would imply is that we could use VALMT to give to elderly people, and if they perform like elderly A, then we celebrate and we think there's not going to be any problems. But if they perform like elderly B, then they might be candidates for drugs that might slow things down. And if we can't stop the disorder, but we can catch it much earlier and try to do work with preventing that disorder getting worse, we might actually plateau or slow down the disease progression. So this is an incredibly exciting project that we're now working on, and we've got researchers in a number of European countries and in India helping us with this to try to see how people in different countries perform on the VALMT. So if any of you works in another country or knows people who work in other countries in dementia, then do let us know, because we'd be very happy to share our work. The other thing is that we also need people to take our tests so that we can build up a larger set of data to show what our elderly A's should perform like, what our elderly B should perform like, and also how our young people should be performing. So, to summarize, we can see that memory is very complex. We also know that forgetting is natural. It happens for all of us, and it should do. But abnormal forgetting can happen for a variety of reasons, such as the encephalitis that poor Nicholas suffered from. Now, the rate of diagnosis of dementia is increasing globally, and that's just, it's a time bomb waiting to go off, as we can see, with the diagnosis of dementia probably trebling in a 35-year period. Drug treatments to cure or even slow down the dementias have so far been quite unsuccessful. And there is some promising work which is showing the possibility of detecting the dementias at much earlier time points. And this, we hope, will help with supporting and caring for patients. And that's the work that we're currently doing, and which we very much appreciate your input into. And in fact, I'm going to put a link on Facebook later on this evening for a database that we're creating for people that we'd like to contribute to our research by taking part in online research that we've got, which will be completely anonymous, so no one else will know about your performance. It'll all be scored by computers, etc. And we want people of all ages, genders and nationalities to do the studies. So I'll be posting that information in a little while, because basically more research is needed. So finally, in terms of the studies that we're doing, as I said, we've got this work on trying to detect preclinical signs of dementia across different languages. We've got the face recognition work that I talked about in one of my earlier talks to do with prosopagnosia and trying to improve diagnosis of prosopagnosia in children. Then my work on executive functions, which is how the front of the brain manages behavior and the impacts of traumatic brain injuries in adults, developmental disorders in kids and adolescents, the impacts of recreational drugs, and the involvement of childhood head injuries in later criminal behavior. And then some work that one of the members of the team is doing that I'm not directly involved in, but which is very exciting, is using music to improve movement rehabilitation following stroke. So there's quite a few different areas that people could get involved in if they wanted to find out about research. And we're always happy to have college kids and possibly school kids as well, depending on parental consent, to take part in our research. So please do get in touch with us. If you could email my PhD student, Claudia Pulcini, c.pulcini@goal.ac.uk. So that just leaves me to thank you for tuning in and for your patience in listening to me. The next talk will hopefully be the second part of my talk about unusual brain disorders, where I'm going to be telling you about very bizarre brain disorders and what they tell us about how the normal brain functions, and I'll be announcing the details soon. I've got a couple of questions. The first is from Nayanika Sengupta, who's asked, can the progress be slowed down of these dementias? At the moment, no. That's part of the problem, that there isn't anything convincing that suggested that you can slow them down. I think that with some of the earlier drugs with the dementia, I think Aricept was one of them, they thought that it was possible to maybe slow down the dementia. So rather than stop it, at least slow it down or plateau it. But I haven't seen anything that suggests that it's possible to slow it down, which is part of the problem. Next question is from William Grave. The question is deja vu potentially to do with failure in our short-term memory and how we experience something in the present? Alternatively, are we just remembering an experience we have had in a dream? And as we've had thousands of dreams in a lifetime, the odds are it's bound to be reenacted in our awake life. It's an interesting question, William, about deja vu. So for those of you who don't know what deja vu is, it's this idea that feeling that you've already experienced this thing before, it's happened before. I don't know anything about deja vu, I'm afraid, but I think it could be any of those things. Trying to work out whether something has actually happened or not is a difficult thing. And if you saw my talk about strange brain disorders, so that was about 2 weeks ago, I talk about confabulation and the fact that there are patients who create memories and swear that they've happened and they haven't. So deja vu might be the reverse of that, of having a feeling that something has already happened, even though they haven't created the memory. So I think it's very difficult to tell. And short-term memory isn't part of the issue, because short-term memory, as I showed, is only the last 60 seconds or so. So I don't think short-term memory is the issue. I think it's to do with the functioning of the temporal lobes here, which are the memory centers. But what is involved, I'm not sure. I seem to remember that there was work that suggested that there's an involvement of maybe subclinical epilepsy, but don't quote me on that. Okay, so Nyanika has also asked another question, which is that her grandfather had Alzheimer's. In his final years, he only talked about his early days. What is the age this usually starts, and is it passed to the next generation? Because her father, who is in his early 50s, faces minor forgetfulness in day-to-day life. Well, the talking about the earlier days is what I demonstrated with Ron, saying that his memories from his childhood became much clearer. And there's the cartoon of the kids playing football. And I said that that was the reminiscence bomb. So that's unsurprising about talking about those childhood years. In terms of the genetics, there is a genetic component, but we don't know how strong it is. So at the moment, in terms of what the percentage of heritability is, as we call it, we don't know. But it is likely that there is a genetic contribution, which means that the likelihood is there. But the big thing we know in human behavior is the interplay between nature and nurture. So you can have the genetics for having a particular problem, but unless the nurture, which is your environment, brings it out, you can have a life without that ever coming out. So there are people who have the genetics for schizophrenia, for example, who never actually show any schizophrenia because their condition around them has been stable enough. So there might be protective factors that mean that people who've got the genetics for dementia are nonetheless being protected from some of these problems happening. And this is why people look at some of these aging communities around the world. There's one in Japan, another one in Italy. I can't remember where the third one is, maybe in Greece, where there are people who've lived to much older ages, and they'll be looking at these people and looking at their genetics to see whether they have the genetics for dementias, but are not showing it. But that's still a long way off. In terms of when it starts showing itself, I think that it might be early 50s, which would be worrying for me because I'm 53. But there are people who show signs of dementias earlier and others who don't show it till much later. And this is part of the problem, that this term it's way too broad. It's going to take us a long time to work out all the differences between the different dementias and whether there's genetics to it, when the problems start appearing, etc. All the people that work in the field can do is to tell you what happens on average, and on average it's probably in the early 50s or mid 50s that the problems start demonstrating themselves. Okay. So Rosie Ball has asked, thinking about that glass of wine, the large glass at the end, how strong is the evidence regarding the link between alcohol and dementia? Should we be cutting down, or is it just one of those multiple factors, including genetic disposition? Good question, Rosie. The answer is I haven't got a clue. I haven't heard of anything that suggests that drinking alcohol is related to dementia. I think drinking too much alcohol is related to various different health problems, and that can result in general cognitive problems, which are more broad cognitive problems rather than memory related. So I think this is where people who work in the field, and clinicians particularly, have a problem, because you can have what we call the presentation, which is what someone comes to the clinical office with, or to the hospital, etc., and they're maybe a bit disorientated, or maybe their family is saying that he keeps forgetting things or she keeps doing this. Now, as someone who doesn't know them, I'm not a clinician, but a clinician would be trying to work out, okay, so is this just because this is what this person's been like all their life, or are they suffering some sort of behavioral, it's some sort of psychological or physical disorder? And so trying to work out whether alcohol has caused a problem in someone is actually quite difficult to do. You can tell if someone has too much and the impact on them, but a little bit we just don't know. So there's enough work that suggested that some alcohol and certain types of alcohol can be helpful or protective to some people. And that's the problem. It's some bits for some people. So if you're really lucky and you're drinking the right type of wine and you've got the right genetics, then maybe it's going to help you. But you could also be someone who's got the genetics for something going wrong and you're drinking a particularly bad, not cheap wine, but something that has a particular sulfite or something in it, which might be exacerbating the problem that you already have. So it's impossible, completely impossible, to make generalities at this point. So I would say that if someone is concerned about alcohol, then they should just do it in moderation, just in case, because people sometimes find that taking out one or two things out of their diet improves things. Now, whether it's a direct cause or an indirect cause, we don't know. But certainly, I haven't seen anything that suggests dementia and alcohol are linked. Now, I have to point out that I'm not a specialist in dementia. The work that we've been doing with trying to detect dementia is a really new part of our research. It's very exciting. But before, I used to only work with people with stable disorders, such as Nicola. So I'm only beginning to learn some of these things myself. Okay, the next question is from Lynn Farley. Hello, Lynn. Lovely of you to listen in. So Lynn asks, are there exercises that we can do to prevent dementia? Is diet a factor or physical conditions of our lives? So that dovetails into Rosie's question that there are things that we can. I don't think that we can prevent dementia, because prevent dementia effectively implies that we know what causes dementia, and we don't know what causes dementia, so we can't prevent it. I think that there are a whole host of things that we know seem to be good for the brain. And in one of my earlier talks, I talked about mindfulness meditation and some wonderful work which is showing that people who've been long-term meditators tend to have less thinning of important parts of the brain, including those frontal parts of the brain, which are the control centers and which are implicated, at least in frontotemporal dementia, but generally in healthy aging, those parts of the brains are the first to start thinning down. And what the work on mindfulness meditation has shown is that people who've been long-term meditators don't show the same level of thinning. So mindfulness meditation seems to be really good. I think diet will be good, because diet, what we eat, what we drink, etc., feeds our blood and our brain cells. And we know that there are certain things to do with fatty acids, I think, and certain types of fish that are really good. So I don't think that there's anything that's known to be good overall. And I think that there's going to be a growth industry to try to understand that better. But I think that generally keeping active means that your blood circulation, etc., is really good, and then having a good diet is going to be pushing better nutrients into your brain. These fishes with certain fatty acids, I think mackerel and things like that, are supposed to be very good, because some of those fats are really good for the nerve cells and protecting them. In terms of other foods, the superfoods, etc., I don't know. I think it's too early at the moment to have the knowledge about specific dietary supplements and things like that. So I would say generally having a healthier lifestyle, and as I know you're very active intellectually and mentally, that really helps as well, because generally in psychology and in memory, we have a saying, which is use it or lose it. And so these people who are really sharp, elderly people, some of them have just kept going. And it's rather amazing that one of the most important researchers in world research on memory disorders, she's the person who discovered this famous patient called HM, who had to have the middle parts of his temporal lobes taken out because of severe epilepsy. And unfortunately, when they took those out, what they found was that he didn't lay down another long-term memory for another 55 years. What was Brenda Milner was the woman who did this work with this young man. She's now, I think, 102 years old, and she's still working at the Montreal Neurological Institute, and she's as sharp as a button. So if Brenda can keep going like that, then I think that suggests that keeping active with your mind is obviously at least one of the good ingredients to healthy cognitive aging. But we also know that if you've got the genetics of something, so for example, Terry Pratchett, Terry Jones, Tony's father, Ron, etc., if you've got those, then at the moment we don't have anything that can stop that. If you don't have those, then I think that it is possible to protect what you've got, and just to, like a muscle, to keep it active. Okay, William Grave has asked another question, which is, when it comes to music, why can those with dementia remember the tune and even lyrics of songs from their youth so vividly? What makes music so memorable? That is an interesting question, William. I don't know much about music, and I think Pedro, the unicorn saxophonist, he might have an answer for this, and if he has one, then I'll post it. I think one of the things about music is that it uses different types of information. It's not just the sound of the information, it's about the rhythm. It brings emotions into our, it involves our emotional experience as well. It might make us think of visually of things. And I think that what happens with music is that it connects things quite a lot. And if it connects things a lot, then what happens is that you probably have stronger memories. And I think that's why music is so important for that. In the talk that I gave last week, I talked about, I started the talk with the work of Proust, and how in his book on the remembrance of things past, he talked about these Madeleine cakes that his aunt made, and how those were so evocative for remembering his childhood. And that showed that there are these other senses, and smell being a really important one, that can evoke memories in the way that a lot of other things can't. And maybe music has that. And in fact, at Goldsmiths, where I work, we've got a world-leading music, mind and brain program, and we know that music is in all the cultures. It seems to be really important for all sorts of things that we do that we're only beginning to scratch the surface of. So it's probably the case that there's something quite fundamental to music. And if it involves emotions, then the emotional centers are deeper in the brain, and they're not affected by Alzheimer's as much, because Alzheimer's is mainly what we call a neocortical or cognitive disorder. So it's affecting the outside of the brain, which is the thinking areas of the brain. But emotion is further inside the brain. And if music is at some levels tapping into the emotions, then it might be that because those areas aren't damaged in people with dementias, that those memories and those connections are held more strongly. And that is a speculation, but I'd be willing to bet a pint or three on that one. So I don't know the answer, but that's my speculation on that. So thank you very much for tuning in. I hope you've enjoyed the talk. Stay safe, and I will be in touch about the next talk pretty soon.